I suppose I had expected, or had dreaded, something so dreary that what greeted me was a good surprise. I remember as a thoroughly pleasant impression the broad, clear front, its open windows and fresh curtains, and the pair of maids looking out. I remember the lawn and the bright flowers and the clustered treetops over which the rooks circled and cawed in the golden sky. The scene had a greatness that made it a different affair from my own scant home, and there immediately appeared at the door, with a little girl in her hand, a civil person who dropped me as decent a curtsy as if I had been the mistress or a distinguished visitor. I had received in Harley Street a narrower notion of the place, and that, as I recalled it, made me think the proprietor still more of a gentleman. I was carried triumphantly through the following hours by my introduction to the younger of my pupils. The little girl who accompanied Mrs. Gross affected me on the spot as a creature too charming not to make it a great fortune to have to do with her. Child I had ever seen. To watch, teach, form little Flora would too evidently be the making of a happy and useful life. I should have her as a matter of course at night, her small white bed being already arranged to that end in my room. What I had undertaken was the whole care of her. And the little boy, does he look like her? Is he too so very remarkable? One wouldn't, it was already conveyed between us, too grossly flatter a child. Oh, miss, most remarkable. If you think well of this one, you will be carried away by the little gentleman. Well, that, I think, is what I came for, to be carried away. I'm afraid, however, I remember feeling the impulse to add, I'm rather easily carried away. I was carried away in London. In Harley Street? In Harley Street. Well, miss, you're not the first and you won't be the last. Oh, I've no pretensions. My other pupil, at any rate, as I understand, comes back tomorrow. No, not tomorrow, Friday, miss. He arrives as you did by the coach, under care of the guard, and is to be met by the same carriage. I forthwith wanted to know if the proper, as well as the pleasant and friendly thing, wouldn't therefore be that on the arrival of the public conveyance, I should await him with his little sister, a proposition to which Mrs. Gross assented so heartily that I somehow took her manner as a kind of comforting pledge that we should on every question be quite at one. Oh, she was glad I was there. I reflected that my first duty was, by the gentlest arts I could contrive, to win Flora into the sense of knowing me. I spent the day with her out of doors. I arranged with her, to her great satisfaction, that it should be she only, who might show me the place. She showed it step by step and room by room and secret by secret, with droll, delightful childish talk about it, and with the result, in half an hour, of our becoming tremendous friends. Young as she was, I was struck throughout our little tour with her confidence and courage, with the way, in empty chambers and dull corridors, on crooked staircases that made me pause, and even on the summit of an old machicolated square tower that made me dizzy, her morning music, her disposition to tell me so many more things than she asked, rang out and led me on. I have not seen Bly since the day I left it, and I dare say that to my present, older and more informed eyes, it would show a very reduced importance. But as my little conductress, with her hair of gold and her frock of blue, danced before me round corners and pattered down passages, I had the view of a castle of romance inhabited by a rosy sprite. Wasn't it just a storybook over which I had fallen a doze and a dream? No, it was a big, ugly, antique, but convenient house, embodying a few features of a building still older, half displaced and half utilized, in which I had the fancy of our being almost as lost as a handful of passengers in a great drifting ship. Well, I was strangely at the helm. The post bag that evening contained a letter for me which, however, in the hand of my employer, I found to be composed but of a few words, enclosing another, addressed to himself, with a seal still unbroken. This, I recognize, is from the headmaster, and the headmaster's an awful bore. Read him, please. Deal with him. But mind you don't report. Not a word. I'm off. I broke the seal with a great effort. What does it mean? The child's dismissed his school. Mrs. Gross gave me a look that I remarked at the moment, then, visibly, with a quick blankness, seemed to try to take it back. But aren't they all? Sent home, yes, but only for the holidays. Miles may never go back at all. Consciously, under my attention, she reddened. They won't take him? They absolutely decline. But what has he done? I cast about, then I judged best simply to hand her my document, which, however, had the effect of making her, without taking it, simply put her hands behind her. She shook her head sadly. Such things are not for me, miss. My counsellor couldn't read. I winced at my mistake, which I attenuated as I could, and opened the letter again to repeat it to her. Then, faltering in the act and folding it up once more, I put it back in my pocket. Is he really bad? Do the gentlemen say so? They go into no particulars. They simply express their regret that it should be impossible to keep him. Oh, it's too dreadful, cried Mrs. Gross. Why, he's scarce 10 years old. The next day, as the hour for my drive approached, I asked, what was the lady who was here before? The last governess? She was also young and pretty, almost as young and almost as pretty, miss, even as you. Ah, then, I hope her youth and her beauty helped her, I recollect throwing off. He seems to like us young and pretty. Oh, he did, Mrs. Gross assented. It was the way he liked everyone. She had no sooner spoken, indeed, than she caught herself up. I mean, that's his way, the master's. I was struck. But of whom did you speak first? She looked blank, but she coloured. Why, of him. Of the master? Of who else? There was so obviously no one else that the next moment I had lost my impression of her having accidentally said more than she meant, and I merely asked what I wanted to know. Did she see anything in the boy that wasn't right? She never told me. I had a scruple, but I overcame it. Was she careful, particular? Mrs. Gross appeared to try to be conscientious. About some things, yes, but not about all. Again she considered. Well, miss, she's gone. I won't tell tales. Well, I quite understand your feeling, I hastened to reply, but I thought it after an instant, not opposed to this concession, to pursue. Did she die here? No, she went off. I don't know what there was in this brevity of Mrs. Gross's that struck me as ambiguous. Went off to die? Mrs. Gross looked straight out of the window, but I felt that, hypothetically, I had a right to know what young persons engaged for Bly were expected to do. She was taken ill, you mean, and went home. She was not taken ill, so far as appeared in this house. She left it at the end of the year to go home, as she said, for a short holiday, to which the time she'd put in had certainly given her a right, but our young lady never came back, and at the very moment I was expecting her, I heard from the master that she was dead. I turned this over. But of what? He never told me. But please, miss, said Mrs. Gross, I must get back to my work. I was a little late on the scene of Miles's arrival, and I felt, as he stood wistfully looking out for me before the door of the inn at which the coach had put him down, that I had seen him on the instant, without and within, in the great glow of freshness, the same positive fragrance of purity in which I had from the first moment seen his little sister. He was incredibly beautiful, and Mrs. Gross had put her finger on it. Everything but a sort of passion of tenderness for him was swept away by his presence. What I then and there took him to my heart for was something divine that I have never found to the same degree in any child. His indescribable little air of knowing nothing in the world but love. It would have been impossible to carry a bad name with the greater sweetness of innocence, and by the time I had got back to Bly with him, I remained merely bewildered, so far, that is, as I was not outraged, by the sense of the horrible letter locked up in one of the drawers of my room. As soon as I could compass a private word with Mrs. Gross, I declared to her that it was grotesque. She promptly understood me. You mean the cruel charge? It doesn't live an instant. My dear woman, look at him. She smiled at my pretension to have discovered his charm. I assure you, miss, I do nothing else. What will you say, then? She immediately added. In answer to the letter? I had made up my mind. Nothing at all. And to his uncle? I was incisive. Nothing at all. And to the boy himself? I was wonderful. Nothing at all. She gave with her apron a great wipe to her mouth. Then I'll stand by you. We'll see it out. We'll see it out, I ardently echoed, giving her my hand to make it a vow. In the first weeks, the days were long. They often, at their finest, gave me what I used to call my own hour, the hour when, for my pupils, tea-time and bedtime having come and gone, I had before my final retirement a small interval alone. Much as I liked my companions, this hour was the thing in the day I liked most, and I liked it best of all when, as the light faded, or rather I should say, the day lingered and the last calls of the last birds sounded in a flushed sky from the old trees, I could take a turn into the grounds and enjoy, almost with a sense of property that amused and flattered me, the beauty and dignity of the place. It was a pleasure at these moments to feel myself tranquil and justified, doubtless perhaps also to reflect that by my discretion, my quiet good sense and general high propriety, I was giving pleasure, if he ever thought of it, to the person to whose pressure I had yielded. What I was doing was what he had earnestly hoped and directly asked of me, and that I could, after all, do it proved even a greater joy than I had expected. I dare say I fancied myself, in short, a remarkable young woman, and took comfort in the faith that this would more publicly appear. Well, I needed to be remarkable to offer a front to the remarkable things that presently gave their first sign. It was plump one afternoon, in the middle of my very hour. The children were tucked away, and I had come out for my stroll. One of the thoughts that, as I don't in the least shrink now from noting, used to be with me in these wanderings, was that it would be as charming as a charming story suddenly to meet someone. Someone would appear there at the turn of the path and would stand before me and smile and approve. I didn't ask more than that. I only asked that he should know, and the only way to be sure he knew would be to see it, and the kind light of it in his handsome face. That was exactly present to me, by which I mean the face was, when, on the first of these occasions, at the end of a long June day, I stopped short on emerging from one of the plantations and coming into view of the house. What arrested me on the spot, and with a shock much greater than any vision had allowed for, was the sense that my imagination had, in a flash, turned real. He did stand there, but high up, beyond the lawn and at the very top of the tower to which, on the first morning, little Flora had conducted me. It produced in me, this figure, in the clear twilight, I remember, two distinct gasps of emotion, which were, sharply, the shock of my first and that of my second surprise. My second was a violent perception of the mistake of my first. The man who met my eyes was not the person I had precipitately supposed. There came to me thus a bewilderment of vision of which, after these years, there is no living view that I can hope to give. An unknown man in a lonely place is a permitted object of fear to a young woman privately bred, and the figure that faced me was, a few seconds more assured me, as little anyone else I knew as it was the image that had been in my mind. I had not seen it in Harley Street. I had not seen it anywhere. The place, moreover, in the strangest way in the world, had on the instant and by the very fact of its appearance become a solitude. It was as if, while I took in what I did take in, all the rest of the scene had been stricken with death. I can hear again now the intense hush in which the sounds of evening dropped. The rooks stopped cawing in the golden sky, and the friendly hour lost, for the unspeakable minute, all its voice. But there was no other change in nature, unless it were a change that I saw with a stranger sharpness. The gold was still in the sky, the clearness in the air, and the man who looked at me over the battlements was as definite as a picture in a frame. That's how I thought, with extraordinary quickness, of each person he might have been, and that he wasn't. We were confronted across our distance quite long enough for me to ask myself with intensity who then he was, and to feel, as an effect of my inability to say, a wonder that in a few seconds more became intense. We were too far apart to call to each other, but there was a moment at which, at shorter range, some challenge between us, breaking the hush, would have been the right result of our straight mutual stare. He was in one of the angles, the one away from the house, very erect, as it struck me, and with both hands on the ledge. Then, exactly after a minute, as if to add to the spectacle, he slowly changed his place, passed, looking at me hard all the while, to the opposite corner of the platform. During this transit, he never took his eyes from me, and I can see at this moment the way his hand, as he went, moved from one of the crenellations to the next. He stopped at the other corner, but less long, and even as he turned away, still markedly fixed me. He turned away. That was all I knew. I can't say how long I remained where I had had my collision. I only recall that when I re-entered the house, darkness had quite closed in. Agitation, in the interval, certainly had held me and driven me, for I must, in circling about the place, have walked 3 miles, but I was to be later on so much more overwhelmed that this mere dawn of alarm was a comparatively human chill. The most singular part of it, in fact, singular as the rest had been, was the part I became in the hall aware of in meeting Mrs. Gross. It came to me straightway under her contact that with plain heartiness and mere relieved anxiety at my appearance, she knew nothing whatever that could bear upon the incident I had there ready for her. On the spot, accordingly, in the pleasant hall and with her eyes on me, I, for a reason that I couldn't then have phrased, achieved an inward resolution, offered a vague pretext for my lateness, and, with the plea of the beauty of the night and the heavy dew and wet feet, went as soon as possible to my room. Here it was another affair. Here, for many days after, it was a queer affair enough. There were hours from day to day, or at least there were moments, snatched even from clear duties, when I had to shut myself up to think. For the truth I had now to turn over was simply and clearly the truth that I could arrive at no account whatever of the visitor with whom I had been so inexplicably, and yet, as it seemed to me, so intimately concerned. There was but one sane inference. Someone had taken a liberty rather monstrous. That was what, repeatedly, I dipped into my room and locked the door to say to myself. The good thing, after all, was that we should surely see no more of him. This was not so good a thing, I admit, as not to leave me to judge that what essentially made nothing else much signify was simply my charming work. My charming work was just my life with Miles and Flora, and through nothing could I so like it as through feeling that to throw myself into it was to throw myself out of my trouble. The attraction of my small charges was a constant joy, leading me to wonder afresh at the vanity of my original fears, the distaste I had begun by entertaining for the probable grey prose of my office. There was to be no grey prose, it appeared, and no long grind. So how could work not be charming that presented itself as daily beauty? It was all the romance of the nursery and the poetry of the schoolroom. I don't mean by this, of course, that we studied only fiction and verse. I mean I can express no otherwise the sort of interest my companions inspired. How can I describe that, except by saying that instead of growing deadly used to them, and it's a marvel for a governess, I call the sisterhood to witness, I made constant fresh discoveries. I was dazzled by their loveliness. There was a Sunday to get on, when it rained with such force and for so many hours that there could be no procession to church, in consequence of which, as the day declined, I had arranged with Mrs. Gross that, should the evening show improvement, we would attend together the late service. The rain happily stopped, and I prepared for our walk. Coming downstairs to meet my colleague in the hall, I remembered a pair of gloves. The gloves had been dropped in that cold, clean temple of mahogany and brass, the grown-up dining room. and I turned in to recover them. The day was grey enough, but the afternoon light still lingered, and it enabled me, on crossing the threshold, not only to recognize on a chair near the wide window, then closed, the articles I wanted, but to become aware of a person on the other side of the window and looking straight in. One step into the room had sufficed. My vision was instantaneous. It was all there. The person looking straight in was the person who had already appeared to me. He appeared thus again with, I won't say greater distinctness, for that was impossible, but with a nearness that represented a forward stride in our intercourse and made me, as I met him, catch my breath and turn cold. He was the same. He was the same, and seen this time as he had been seen before. His face was close to the glass, yet the effect of this better view was, strangely, just to show me how intense the former had been. He remained but a few seconds, long enough to convince me he also saw and recognized, but it was as if I had been looking at him for years and had known him always. Something, however, happened this time that had not happened before. His stare into my face, through the glass and across the room, was as deep and hard as then, but it quitted me for a moment, during which I could still watch it, see it fix successively several other things. On the spot there came to me the added shock of a certitude that it was not for me he had come. He had come for someone else. The flash of this knowledge, for it was knowledge in the midst of dread, produced in me the most extraordinary effect, starting as I stood there, a sudden vibration of duty and courage. I say courage because I was beyond all doubt already far gone. I bounded straight out of the door again, reached that of the house, got in an instant up the drive, and, passing along the terrace as fast as I could rush, turned a corner and came in full sight. But it was in sight of nothing now. My visitor had vanished. There were shrubberies and big trees, but I remember the clear assurance I felt that none of them concealed him. He was there or was not there. Not there if I didn't see him. I got hold of this then instinctively, instead of returning as I had come, went to the window. It was confusedly present to me that I ought to place myself where he had stood. I did so. I applied my face to the pane and looked as he had looked into the room. As if at this moment, to show me exactly what his range had been, Mrs. Gross, as I had done for himself just before, came in from the hall. With this, I had the full image of a repetition of what had already occurred. She saw me as I had seen my own visitant. She pulled up short as I had done. I gave her something of the shock that I had received. She turned white, and this made me ask myself if I had blanched as much. She stared, in short, and retreated just on my lines, and I knew she had then passed out and come round to me, and that I should presently meet her. I remained where I was, and while I waited, I thought of more things than one. But there's only one I take space to mention. I wondered why she should be scared. Oh, she let me know as soon as, round the corner of the house, she loomed again into view. What in the name of goodness is the matter? She was now flushed and out of breath. I said nothing till she came quite near. With me? I must have made a wonderful face. Do I show it? You're as white as a sheet. Has anything happened? Yes, you must know now. Just what you saw from the dining room a minute ago was the effect of that. What I saw just before was much worse. Her hand tightened. What was it? An extraordinary man looking in. What extraordinary man? I haven't the least idea. Mrs. Gross gazed round us in vain. Then where has he gone? I know still less. Have you seen him before? Yes, once, on the old tower. She thought a minute. Was he a gentleman? I found I had no need to think. No. She gazed in deeper wonder. No. Then nobody about the place? Nobody from the village? Nobody. I didn't tell you, but I made sure." She breathed a vague relief. This was oddly so much to the good. "But if he isn't a gentleman, what is he? He's a horror." She didn't move. "How long was he here?" "Till I came out. I came to meet him." Mrs. Gross at last turned round, and there was still more in her face. "I couldn't have come out." "Neither could I, but I did come. I've my duty." "So have I mine," she replied, after which she added, "What's he like?" "He has no hat." Then, seeing in her face that she already in this, with a deeper dismay, found a touch of picture, I quickly added stroke to stroke, "He has red hair, very red, close curling and a pale face, long in shape, with straight, good features and little, rather queer whiskers that are as red as his hair. His eyebrows are somehow darker. They look particularly arched and as if they might move a good deal. His eyes are sharp, strange, awfully. But I only know clearly that they're rather small and very fixed. His mouth's wide and his lips are thin, and except for his little whiskers, he's quite clean-shaven. And dressed in somebody's clothes. They're smart, but they're not his own." She broke into a breathless, affirmative groan. "They're the master's." I caught it up. "You do know him?" She faltered but a second. "Quint," she cried. "Quint? Peter Quint, his own man, his valet, when he was here." "When the master was?" Gaping still, but meeting me, she pieced it all together. "He never wore his hat, but he did wear, well, there were waistcoats missed. They were both here last year. Then the master went, and Quint was alone." I followed, but halting a little. "Alone?" "Alone with us." Then, as from a deeper depth, "In charge," she added. "And what became of him?" She hung fire so long that I was still more mystified. "He went too," she brought out at last. "Went where?" Her expression at this became extraordinary. "God knows where. He died." "Died!" I almost shrieked. She seemed fairly to square herself, plant herself more firmly to express the wonder of it. "Yes, Mr. Quint's dead." Mrs. Gross herself had seen nothing, not the shadow of a shadow, and nobody in the house but the governess was in the governess's plight. Yet she accepted, without directly impugning my sanity, the truth as I gave it to her. "He was looking for someone else, you say? Someone who was not you?" "He was looking for little Miles." A portentous clearness now possessed me. That's whom he was looking for. "But how do you know?" I know. My exultation grew. "And you know, my dear." She didn't deny this, but I required, I felt, not even so much telling as that. She took it up again in a moment. "What if he should see him?" "Little Miles? That's what he wants." She looked immensely scared again. "The child? Heaven forbid, the man. He wants to appear to them." I had an absolute certainty that I should see again what I had already seen, but something within me said that by offering myself bravely as the sole subject of such experience, by accepting, by inviting, by surmounting it all, I should serve as an expiatory victim and guard the tranquillity of the rest of the household. The children in especial I should thus fence about and absolutely save. I recall one of the last things I said that night to Mrs. Gross. "It does strike me that my pupils have never mentioned the time they were with him, and his name, his presence, his history in any way. They've never alluded to it." "Oh, the little lady doesn't remember. She never heard or knew." I thought it was some intensity. "Perhaps not, but Miles would remember. Miles would know." "Ah, don't try him," broke from Mrs. Gross. I returned her the look she had given me. It is rather odd. I now saw that I had been asked for a service admirable and difficult, and there would be a greatness in letting it be seen, in the right quarter, that I could succeed where many another girl might have failed. It was an immense help to me, I confess I rather applaud myself as I look back, that I saw my response so strongly and so simply. I was there to protect and defend the little creatures in the world, the most bereaved and the most lovable, the appeal of whose helplessness had suddenly become only too explicit, a deep, constant ache of one's own engaged affection. We were cut off, really, together. We were united in our danger. They had nothing but me, and I had them. It was, in short, a magnificent chance. This chance presented itself to me in an image richly material. I was a screen. I was to stand before them. The more I saw, the less they would. I began to watch them in a stifled suspense, a disguised tension that might well, had it continued too long, have turned to something like madness. What saved me, as I now see, was that it turned to another matter altogether. It didn't last as suspense. It was superseded by horrible proofs. Proofs, I say, yes, from the moment I really took hold. This moment dated from an afternoon hour that I happened to spend in the grounds with the younger of my pupils alone. We had left Miles indoors on the red cushion of a deep window seat. He had wished to finish a book, and I had been glad to encourage a purpose so laudable in a young man. His sister, on the contrary, had been alert to come out, and I strolled with her on the edge of the lake for half an hour, seeking the shade, for the sun was still high and the day exceptionally warm. Suddenly, I became aware that on the other side of the lake we had an interested spectator. The way this knowledge gathered in me was the strangest thing in the world, the strangest, that is, except the very much stranger in which it quickly merged itself. I had sat down with a piece of work on the old stone bench which overlooked the pond, and in this position I began to take in, with certitude and yet without direct vision, the presence, a good way off, of a third person. The old trees, the thick shrubbery, made a great and pleasant shade, but it was all suffused with the brightness of the hot, still hour. There was no ambiguity in anything, none whatever, at least in the conviction that I, from one moment to another, found myself forming as to what I should see straight before me and across the lake as a consequence of raising my eyes. They were attached at this juncture to the stitching in which I was engaged, and I can feel once more the spasm of my effort not to move them till I should so have steadied myself as to be able to make up my mind what to do. There was an alien object in view, a figure whose right of presence I instantly and passionately questioned. Of the positive identity of the apparition I would assure myself as soon as the small clock of my courage should have ticked out the right second. Meanwhile, I transferred my eyes straight to little Flora, who at the moment was about 10 yards away. My heart had stood still for an instant with the wonder and terror of the question, whether she too would see, and I held my breath while I waited for a cry from her, what some sudden innocent sign, either of interest or alarm, would tell me. I waited, but nothing came. Then in the first place, and there's something more dire in this, I feel, than in anything I have to relate, I was determined by a sense that within a minute all spontaneous sounds from her had dropped, and in the second by the circumstance that also within the minute she had, in her play, turned her back to the water. I still hear myself cry as I fairly threw myself into Mrs. Gross's arms. They know! It's too monstrous! They know! They know! 2 hours ago in the garden, I could scarce articulate, Flora saw. Mrs. Gross took it as she might have taken a blow in the stomach. She has told you? She panted. Not a word, that's the horror. She kept it all to herself. The child of 8, that child! Unutterable still for me was the stupefaction of it. Mrs. Gross, of course, could only gape the wider. Then how do you know? I was there. I saw with my eyes, saw. She was perfectly aware. Do you mean of him? No, of her. I was conscious as I spoke that I looked prodigious things, for I got the slow reflection of them in my companion's face. Another person, this time, but a figure of quite as unmistakable horror and evil. a woman in black, pale and dreadful, with such an air also and such a face, on the other side of the lake. I was there with the child, quiet for the hour, and in the midst of it she came. Came out? From where? From where they come from. She just appeared and stood there, but not so near. And without coming nearer? Oh, for the effect and the feeling she might have been as close as you. My friend, with an odd impulse, fell back a step. Was she someone you've never seen? Never, but someone the child has, someone you have. Then, to show how I had thought it all out, my predecessor, the one who died. Miss Jessel? Miss Jessel. You don't believe me? I pressed. She turned right and left in her distress. How can you be sure? This drew from me, in the state of my nerves, a flash of impatience. Then ask Flora. She's sure. But I had no sooner spoken than I caught myself up. No, for God's sake, don't. She'll say she isn't. She'll lie. Flora doesn't want me to know. It's only then to spare you. No, there are depths. The more I go over it, the more I see in it, and the more I see in it, the more I fear. I don't know what I don't see, what I don't fear. Mrs. Gross tried to keep up with me. You mean you're afraid of seeing her again? Oh, no, that's nothing now. Then I explained. It's of not seeing her. But my companion only looked wan. I don't understand. Why, it's that the child may keep it up, and that the child assuredly will without my knowing it. Or isn't it just a proof of her blessed innocence? My friend bravely inquired. She brought me for the instant almost round. Oh, we must clutch at that. We must cling to it. If it isn't a proof of what you say, it's a proof of God knows what, for the woman's a horror of horrors. Mrs. Gross at this fixed her eyes a minute on the ground, then at last raising them. Tell me how you know, she said. No, by seeing her, by the way she looked. She gave me never a glance. She only fixed the child. Mrs. Gross tried to see it. Fixed her? Oh, with such awful eyes, with a determination indescribable, with a kind of fury of intention. I made her turn pale. Intention? To get hold of her. Mrs. Gross, her eyes just lingering on mine, gave a shudder and walked to the window, and while she stood there, looking out, I completed my statement. That's what Flora knows. After a little, she turned round. The person was in black, you say? In mourning, rather poor, almost shabby, but yes, with extraordinary beauty. Handsome, very, very, I insisted. Wonderfully handsome, but infamous. She slowly came back to me. Miss Jessel was infamous. She once more took my hand in both her own, holding it as tight as if to fortify me against the increase of alarm I might draw from this disclosure. They were both infamous, she finally said. So for a little we faced it once more together, and I found absolutely a degree of help in seeing it now so straight. I appreciate, I said, the great decency of your not having hitherto spoken, but the time has certainly come to give me the whole thing. She appeared to assent to this, but still only in silence, seeing which I went on. I must have it now. Of what did she die? Come, there was something between them. There was everything. In spite of the difference, of their rank, their condition, she brought it woefully out. She was a lady. I turned it over. I again saw. Yes, she was a lady. And he so dreadfully below, said Mrs. Gross. I felt that I doubtless needn't press too hard in such company on the place of a servant in the scale, but there was nothing to prevent an acceptance of my companion's own measure of my predecessor's abasement. There was a way to deal with that, and I dealt, the more readily for my full vision on the evidence of our employer's late, clever, good-looking own man, impudent, assured, spoiled, depraved. The fellow was a hound. Mrs. Gross considered as if it were perhaps a little case for a sense of shades. I've never seen anyone like him. He did what he wished. With her? with them all. Poor woman, she paid for it. Then you do know what she died of, I asked. No, I know nothing. I wanted not to know. I was glad enough I didn't. But afterwards I imagined, and I still imagine, and what I imagine is dreadful. Not so dreadful as what I do, I replied, on which I must have shown her a front of miserable defeat. It brought out again all her compassion for me, and at the renewed touch of her kindness, my power to resist broke down. I burst into tears. I don't do it, I sobbed in despair. I don't save or shield them. It's far worse than I dreamed. They're lost. We were to keep our heads if we should keep nothing else, difficult indeed as that might be, in the face of all that in our prodigious experience seemed least to be questioned. Late that night while the house slept, we had another talk in my room, when she went all the way with me as to its being beyond a doubt that I had seen exactly what I had seen. I found that, to keep her thoroughly in the grip of this, I had only to ask her how, if I had made it up, I came to be able to give of each of the persons appearing to me a picture disclosing to the last detail their special marks, a portrait on the exhibition of which she had instantly recognized and named them. On leaving her after my first outbreak, I had of course returned to my pupils. With our small friends' voices in the air, their pressure on one's heart, and their fragrant faces against one's cheek, everything fell to the ground but their incapacity and their beauty. It was a pity to be obliged to reinvestigate the certitude of the moment itself, and repeat how it had come to me as a revelation that the inconceivable communion I then surprised must have been for both parties a matter of habit. It was a pity I should have had to quaver out again the reasons for my not having, in my delusion, so much as questioned that the little girl saw our visitant, even as I actually saw Mrs. Grose herself, and that she wanted, by just so much as she did thus see, to make me suppose she didn't, and at the same time, without showing anything, arrive at a guess as to whether I myself did. Yet if I had not indulged, to prove there was nothing in it, I shouldn't have been prompted by stress of need, by desperation of mind, I scarce know what to call it, to invoke such further aid to intelligence as might spring from pushing my colleague fairly to the wall. She had told me, bit by bit, under pressure, a great deal. For a period of several months, Quint and the boy had been perpetually together. They had been about together quite as if Quint were his tutor, and a very grand one, and Miss Jessel only for the little lady. While he was with the man, Flora was with the woman. It suited them all. Lord, how I pressed her now, so that you could see he knew what was between the two wretches. I don't know, the poor woman wailed. You do know, you dear thing, I replied, only you haven't my dreadful boldness of mind, and you keep back, out of timidity and modesty and delicacy, even the impression that in the past most of all made you miserable. But I shall get it out of you yet. There was something in the boy that suggested to you his covering and concealing their relation. But heavens, I fell with vehemence of thinking, what it shows they must, to that extent, have succeeded in making of him. I used to wonder how my little charges could help guessing that I thought strange things about them, and the circumstance that these things only made them more interesting was not by itself a direct aid to keeping them in the dark. I trembled lest they should see that they were so immensely more interesting. Putting things at the worst, in all events, as in meditation I so often did, any clouding of their innocence could only be blameless and foredoomed as they were, a reason the more for taking risks. There were moments when I knew myself to catch them up by an irresistible impulse and press them to my heart. As soon as I had done so, I used to wonder, what will they think of that? Doesn't it betray too much? If it occurred to me that I might occasionally excite suspicion by the little outbreaks of my sharper passion for them, so too I remember asking if I mightn't see a queerness in the traceable increase of their own demonstrations. They had never, I think, wanted to do so many things for their poor protectress. I mean, though they got their lessons better and better, which was naturally what would please her most, in the way of diverting, entertaining, surprising her, reading her passages, telling her stories, acting her charades, pouncing out at her in disguises as animals and historical characters, and above all, astonishing her by the pieces they had secretly got by heart and could interminably recite. This was so singularly the case that it had presumably much to do with a fact as to which, at the present day, I am at a loss for a different explanation. I allude to my unnatural composure on the subject of another school for Miles. What I remember is that I was content for the time not to open the question, and that contentment must have sprung from the sense of his perpetually striking show of cleverness. He was too clever for a bad governess, for a parson's daughter to spoil, and the strangest, if not the brightest, thread in the pensive embroidery I just spoke of was the impression I might have got, if I had dared to work it out, that he was under some influence operating in his small intellectual life as a tremendous incitement. For such a boy to have been kicked out by a schoolmaster was a mystification without end. I find that I really hang back, but I must take my horrid plunge. In going on with the record of what was hideous at Bly, I not only challenge the most liberal faith, for which I little care, but, and this is another matter, I renew what I myself suffered. I again push my dreadful way through it to the end. One evening I sat reading by a couple of candles. I remember that the book I had in my hand was Fielding's Amelia, also that I was wholly awake. I recall further both a general conviction that it was horribly late and a particular objection to looking at my watch. I figured finally that the white curtain draping in the fashion of those days, the head of Flora's little bed, shrouded, as I had assured myself long before, the perfection of childish rest. I recollect, in short, that though I was deeply interested in my author, I found myself at the turn of a page, and with his spell all scattered, looking straight up from him and hard at the door of my room. There was a moment during which I listened, reminded of the faint sense I had had the first night of there being something undefinably astir in the house, and noted the soft breath of the open casement just move the half-drawn blind. Then, with all the marks of a deliberation that must have been magnificent, had there been anyone to admire it, I laid down my book, rose to my feet, and taking a candle went straight out of the room and from the passage, on which my light made little impression, noiselessly closed and locked the door. I can say now neither what determined nor what guided me, but I went straight along the lobby, holding my candle high, till I came within sight of the tall window that presided over the great turn of the staircase. At this point, I precipitately found myself aware of three things. They were practically simultaneous, yet they had flashes of succession. My candle, under a bold flourish, went out, and I perceived by the uncovered window that the yielding dusk of earliest morning rendered it unnecessary. Without it, the next instant, I knew that there was a figure on the stair. I speak of sequences, but I required no lapse of seconds to stiffen myself for a third encounter with Quint. The apparition had reached the landing halfway up, and was therefore on the spot nearest the window, where, at sight of me, it stopped short, and fixed me exactly as it had fixed me from the tower and from the garden. He knew me as well as I knew him. And so in the cold, faint twilight, with a glimmer in the high glass and another on the polish of the oak stair below, we faced each other in our common intensity. He was absolutely, on this occasion, a living, detestable, dangerous presence. But that was not the wonder of wonders. I reserve this distinction for quite another circumstance, the circumstance that dread had unmistakably quitted me, and that there was nothing in me unable to meet and measure him. I had plenty of anguish after that extraordinary moment, but I had, thank God, no terror, and he knew I hadn't. I found myself at the end of an instant magnificently aware of this. I felt in a fierce rigour of confidence that if I stood my ground a minute, I should cease, for the time at least, to have him to reckon with. And during the minute, accordingly, the thing was as human and hideous as a real interview. Hideous just because it was human as to have met alone in the small hours in a sleeping house some enemy, some adventurer, some criminal. The moment was so prolonged that it would have taken but little more to make me doubt if even I were in life. I can't express what followed it, save by saying that the silence itself, which was indeed in a manner an attestation of my strength, became the element into which I saw the figure disappear. I remained a while at the top of the stair, but with the effect presently of understanding that when my visitor had gone, he had gone. Then I returned to my room. The foremost thing I saw there, by the light of the candle I had left burning, was that Flora's little bed was empty. And on this I caught my breath with all the terror that 5 minutes before I had been able to resist. I dashed to the place where I had left her lying, and over which, for the small silk counterpane and the sheets were disarranged, the white curtains had been deceivingly pulled forward. Then my step, to my unutterable relief, produced an answering sound. I noticed an agitation of the window blind, and the child, ducking down, emerged rosily from the other side of it. She looked intensely grave, and I had never had such a sense of losing an advantage acquired as on my consciousness that she addressed me with a reproach. "You naughty, where have you been?" Instead of challenging her own irregularity, I found myself arraigned and explaining. She herself explained, for that matter, with the loveliest, eagerest simplicity. She had known suddenly as she lay there that I was out of the room, and had jumped up to see what had become of me. "You were looking for me out of the window," I said. "You thought I might be walking in the grounds?" "Well, you know, I thought someone was." She never blanched as she smiled out that at me. Oh, how I looked at her now. "And did you see anyone?" "Ah, no," she returned almost resentfully. If I once more closed my eyes, it was before the dazzle of the 3 or 4 possible ways in which I might take this up. One of these for a moment tempted me with such singular force that, to resist it, I must have gripped my little girl with a spasm that, wonderfully, she submitted to without a cry or a sign of fright. Why not break out at her on the spot and have it all over? Give it to her straight in her lovely little lighted face. You see, you know that you do, and that you already quite suspect I believe it. Therefore, why not frankly confess it to me, so that we may at least live with it together and learn, perhaps in the strangeness of our fate, where we are and what it means? This solicitation dropped, alas, as it came. If I could immediately have succumbed to it, I might have spared myself, well, you'll see what. Instead of succumbing, I sprang again to my feet, looked at her bed, and took a helpless middle way. "Why did you pull the curtain over the place to make me think you were still there?" Flora luminously considered, after which, with her little divine smile, "Because I don't like to frighten you." But if I had, by your idea, gone out, she absolutely declined to be puzzled. She turned her eyes to the flame of the candle, as if the question were as irrelevant, or at any rate as impersonal, as 9 times 9. "Oh, but you know," she quite adequately answered, "that you might come back, you dear, and that you have." You may imagine the general complexion from that moment of my nights. I repeatedly sat up until I don't know when. I selected moments when my roommate unmistakably slept, and, stealing out, took noiseless turns in the passage. I even pushed so far as to where I had last met Quint, but I never met him there again. On the 11th night after my latest encounter with that gentleman, they were all numbered now, I had an alarm that perilously skirted it, and that, indeed, from the particular quality of its unexpectedness, proved quite my sharpest shock. It was precisely the first night during this series that, weary with vigils, I had conceived I might again, without laxity, lay myself down at my old hour. I slept immediately, and, as I afterwards knew, till about 1 o'clock. But when I woke, it was to sit straight up, as completely roused as if a hand had shaken me. I had left a light burning, but it was now out, and I felt an instant certainty that Flora had extinguished it. This brought me to my feet, and straight in the darkness to her bed, which I found she had left. A glance at the window enlightened me further, and the striking of a match completed the picture. The child had again got up, this time blowing out the taper, and had again, for some purpose of observation or response, squeezed in behind the blind and was peering out into the night. That she now saw was proved to me by the fact that she was disturbed neither by my re-illumination nor by the haste I made to get into slippers and a wrap. Hidden, protected, absorbed, she evidently rested on the sill and gave herself up. She was face to face with the apparition we had met at the lake, and could now communicate with it, as she had not then been able to. What I on my side had to care for was, without disturbing her, to reach from the corridor some other window, turned to the same quarter. While I stood in the passage, I had my eyes on her brother's door. What if I should go straight in and march to his window? I wondered if his bed were also empty, and he also secretly at watch. It was a deep, soundless minute, at the end of which my impulse failed. He was quiet. He might be innocent. I turned away. There were empty rooms enough at Bly, and it was only a question of choosing the right one. The right one suddenly presented itself to me as the lower one, though high above the gardens, in the solid corner of the house that I have spoken of as the old tower. I knew my way about in it. I had only, after just faltering at the first chill gloom of its disuse, to pass across it and unbolt in all quietness one of the shutters. Achieving this transit, I uncovered the glass without a sound, and applying my face to the pane, was able, the darkness without being much less than within, to see that I commanded the right direction. Then I saw something more. The moon made the night extraordinarily penetrable, and showed me on the lawn a person, diminished by distance, who stood there motionless and, as if fascinated, looking up to where I had appeared, looking, that is, not so much straight at me as at something that was apparently above me. There was clearly another person above me. There was a person on the tower. But the presence on the lawn was not in the least what I had conceived and had confidently hurried to meet. The presence on the lawn, I felt sick as I made it out, was poor little Miles himself. It was not until late next day that I spoke to Mrs. Gross, the rigour with which I kept my pupils in sight making it often difficult to meet her privately. The more as we each felt the importance of not provoking on the part of the servants quite as much as on that of the children any suspicion of a secret flurry or of a discussion of mysteries. She believed me, I was sure, absolutely. If she hadn't, I don't know what would have become of me, for I couldn't have borne the strain alone. But she was a magnificent monument to the blessing of a want of imagination. Flights of fancy gave place in her mind to a steady fireside glow, and I had already begun to perceive how, with the development of the conviction that, as time went on without a public accident, our young things could, after all, look out for themselves, she addressed her greatest solicitude to the sad case presented by their deputy guardian. She offered her mind to my disclosures as, had I wished to mix a witch's broth, and proposed it with assurance, she would have held out a large, clean saucepan. This had become thoroughly her attitude by the time that, in my recital of the events of that night, I reached the point of what Miles had said to me when, after seeing him at such a monstrous hour, I had gone down to bring him in. As soon as I appeared in the moonlight on the terrace, he had come to me as straight as possible, on which I had taken his hand without a word and led him through the dark spaces, up the staircase where Quint had so hungrily hovered for him, along the lobby where I had listened and trembled, and so to his forsaken room. Not a sound on the way had passed between us, and I had wondered, oh, how I had wondered, if he were groping about in his dreadful little mind for something plausible and not too grotesque. How the deuce would he get out of the scrape? There beat in me, indeed, with the passionate throb of this question, an equal dumb appeal as to how the deuce I should. I was confronted at last, as never yet, with all the risk attached even now to sounding my own horrid note. I remember, in fact, that as we pushed into his little chamber, where the bed had not been slept in at all, and the window, uncovered to the moonlight, made the place so clear that there was no need of striking a match, I remember how I suddenly dropped sank on the edge of the bed from the force of the idea that he must know how he really, as they say, had me. He could do what he liked with all his cleverness to help him, so long as I should continue to defer to the old tradition of the criminality of those caretakers of the young who minister to superstitions and fears. He had me indeed, and in a cleft stick. For who would ever absolve me? Who would consent that I should go unhung if, by the faintest tremor of an overture, I were the first to introduce into our perfect intercourse an element so dire? I had no alternative but, in form at least, to put it to him. You must tell me now, and all the truth. What did you go out for? What were you doing there? I can still see his wonderful smile, the whites of his beautiful eyes, and the uncovering of his clear teeth shine to me in the dusk. If I tell you why, will you understand? My heart at this leaped into my mouth. Would he tell me why? I found no sound on my lips to press it, and I was aware of answering only with a vague, repeated, grimacing nod. Well, he said at last, just exactly in order that you should do this. Do what? Think me, for a change, bad. I shall never forget the sweetness and gaiety with which he brought out the word, nor how, on top of it, he bent forward and kissed me. He had given exactly the account of himself that permitted least my going behind it. And when did you go down? At midnight. When I'm bad, I am bad. I see, it's charming. But how could you be sure I should know it? Oh, I arranged that with Flora. His answers rang out with a readiness. She was to get up and look out, which is what she did do. It was I who fell into the trap. So she disturbed you, and, to see what she was looking at, you also looked and saw, while you, I concurred, caught your death in the night air. He literally bloomed so from this exploit that he could afford radiantly to assent. How otherwise should I have been bad enough? He asked. The particular impression I had received proved in the morning light not quite successfully presentable to Mrs. Gross. It all lies in half a dozen words, I said to her, words that really settle the matter. Think you know what I might do. He threw that off to show me how good he is. He knows down to the ground what he might do. That's what he gave them a taste of at school. Lord, you do change, cried my friend. I don't change. I simply make it out. The four, depend on it, perpetually meet. If on either of these last nights you had been with either child, you'd clearly have understood. The more I've watched and waited, the more I've felt that if there were nothing else to make it sure, it would be made so by the systematic silence of each. Never by a slip of the tongue have they so much as alluded to either of their old friends, any more than Mars has alluded to his expulsion. Oh, yes, we may sit here and look at them, and they may show off to us there to their fill. But even while they pretend to be lost in their fairy tale, they're steeped in their vision of the dead restored to them. He's not reading to her, I declared. They're talking of them. They're talking horrors. I go on, I know, as if I were crazy, and it's a wonder I'm not. What I've seen would have made you so, but it has only made me more lucid, made me get hold of still other things. Of what other things have you got hold? Why, of the very things that have delighted, fascinated, and yet, at bottom, as I now so strangely see, mystified and troubled me. They're more than earthly beauty. They're absolutely unnatural goodness. It's a game, I went on. It's a policy and a fraud. They haven't been good. They've only been absent. It has been easy to live with them because they're simply leading a life of their own. They're not mine. They're not ours. They're his and they're hers. Quince and that woman's. Quince and that woman's. They want to get to them. Oh, how at this poor Mrs. Gross appeared to study them. But for what? For the love of all the evil that in those dreadful days the pair put into them, and to ply them with that evil still, to keep up the work of demons, is what brings the others back. Lord, said my friend under a breath, they were rascals. But what can they do now? "Do," I echoed so loud that Miles and Flora, as they passed at their distance, paused an instant in their walk and looked at us. "They can destroy them. They don't know as yet quite how, but they're trying hard. They're seen only across, as it were, and beyond, in strange places and on high places, the tops of towers, the roof of houses, the outside of windows, the further edge of pools, but there's a deep design on either side to shorten the distance and overcome the obstacle. So the success of the tempters is only a question of time. They've only to keep to their suggestions of danger, for the children to come and perish in the attempt." Mrs. Gross slowly got up, and I scrupulously added, "Unless, of course, we can prevent." Standing there before me, while I kept my seat, she visibly turned things over. "Their uncle must do the preventing. He must take them away. And who's to make him?" She had been scanning the distance, but she now dropped on me a foolish face. "You, miss. By writing to him that his house is poisoned and his little nephew and niece mad? But if they are, miss, and if I am myself, you mean? That's charming news to be sent him by a person enjoying his confidence and whose prime undertaking was to give him no worry." Mrs. Gross considered, following the children again. "Yes, he do hate worry. That was the great reason why those fiends took him in so long. No doubt, though his indifference must have been awful. As I'm not a fiend, at any rate, I shouldn't take him in." My companion, after an instant, and for all answer, sat down again and grasped my arm. "Make him at any rate come to you." I stared. "To me?" I quickly rose, and I think I must have shown her a queerer face than ever yet. "You see me asking him for a visit?" She didn't know, no one knew, how proud I had been to serve him and to stick to our terms. Yet she nonetheless took the measure, I think, of the warning I now gave her. If you should so lose your head as to appeal to him for me— She was really frightened. "Yes, miss. I would leave, on the spot, both him and you." How can I retrace today the strange steps of my obsession? There were times of our being together when I would have been ready to swear that, literally, in my presence, but with my direct sense of it closed, they had visitors who were known and welcome. Then it was that, had I not been deterred by the very chance that such an injury might prove greater than the injury to be averted, my exultation would have broken out. They're here, you little wretches," I would have cried, "and you can't deny it now." The little wretches denied it, with all the added volume of their sociability and their tenderness, just in the crystal depths of which, like the flash of a fish in a stream, the mockery of their advantage peeped up. There appears to me, as I look back, no note in all this more extraordinary than the mere fact that, in spite of my tension and of their triumph, I never lost patience with them. Adorable they must in truth have been, I now feel, since I didn't in those days hate them. Would exasperation, however, if relief had longer been postponed, finally have betrayed me? It little matters, for relief arrived. I call it relief, though it was only the relief that a snap brings to a strain, or the burst of a thunderstorm to a day of suffocation. It was at least a change, and it came with a rush. Walking to church a certain Sunday morning, I had little Miles at my side, and his sister in advance of us, and at Mrs. Gross's well in sight. It was a crisp, clear day, the first of its order for some time. The night had brought a touch of frost, and the autumn air, bright and sharp, made the church bells almost gay. Miles's whole title to independence, the rights of his sex and situation, were so stamped upon him that if he had suddenly struck for freedom, I should have had nothing to say. I was, by the strangest of chances, wondering how I should meet him when the revolution unmistakably occurred. I call it a revolution because I now see how, with the word he spoke, the curtain rose on the last act of my dreadful drama, and the catastrophe was precipitated. "Look here, my dear, he charmingly said, when in the world, please, am I going back to school?" I could feel in him how he already, from my at first finding nothing to reply, perceived the advantage he had gained. I was so slow to find anything that he had plenty of time, after a minute, to continue with his suggestive but inconclusive smile. "You know, my dear, that for a fellow to be with a lady always—" "And always with the same lady?" He neither blanched nor winked. The whole thing was virtually out between us. "It isn't so much that. Well, what is it then? I want my own sort." It literally made me bound forward. "There aren't many of your own sort, Miles, I love Laura. You really compare me to a baby girl." This found me singularly weak. "Don't you then love our sweet Flora? If I didn't, and you too, if I didn't—" Mrs. Gross and Flora had passed into the church, the other worshippers had followed, and we were, for the minute, alone among the old thick graves. He looked, while I waited, about at the graves. Well, you know what. He didn't move. "Does my uncle think what you think?" I markedly rested. "How do you know what I think?" "Oh, well, of course I don't, for it strikes me you never tell me. But I mean, does he know?" "Know what, Miles?" "Why, the way I'm going on." "I don't think your uncle much cares." Miles, on this, stood looking at me. "Then don't you think he can be made to?" "In what way?" "Why, by his coming down." "But who'll get him to come down?" "I will," the boy said with extraordinary brightness and emphasis. He gave me another look charged with expression, and then marched off alone into the church. The business was practically settled from the moment I never followed him. He had got out of me that there was something I was much afraid of, and that he should probably be able to make use of my fear to gain, for his own purpose, more freedom. My fear was of having to deal with the intolerable question of the grounds of his dismissal from school, since that was really but the question of the horrors gathered behind. That his uncle should arrive to treat with me of these things was a solution that, strictly speaking, I ought now to have desired to bring on, but I could so little face the ugliness and the pain of it that I simply procrastinated and lived from hand to mouth. The boy, to my deep discomposure, was immensely in the right, was in a position to say to me, "Either you clear up with my guardian the mystery of this interruption of my studies, or you cease to expect me to lead with you a life that's so unnatural for a boy." I reflected that I had already, with him, hurt myself beyond repair. For the first minute since his arrival, I wanted to get away from him. As I listened to the sounds of worship, I was taken with an impulse that might master me, I felt completely, should I give it the least encouragement. I might easily put an end to my ordeal by getting away altogether. Here was my chance. There was no one to stop me. I could give the whole thing up, turn my back and bolt. It was only a question of hurrying again, for a few preparations, to the house which the attendance at church of so many of the servants would practically have left unoccupied. I came straight out of the churchyard and, thinking hard, retraced my steps through the park. It seemed to me that by the time I reached the house, I had made up my mind to cynical flight. Tormented in the hall with difficulties and obstacles, I remember sinking down at the foot of the staircase, suddenly collapsing there on the lowest step, and then with a revulsion, recalling that it was exactly where, more than a month before, in the darkness of night, and just so bowed with evil things, I had seen the spectre of the most horrible of women. At this I was able to straighten myself. I went the rest of the way up. I made in my turmoil for the schoolroom, where there were objects belonging to me that I should have to take. But I opened the door to find again, in a flash, my eyes unsealed. In the presence of what I saw, I reeled straight back upon my resistance. Seated at my own table in the clear noonday light, I saw a person whom, without my previous experience, I should have taken at the first blush for some housemaid, who might have stayed at home to look after the place, and who, availing herself of rare relief from observation and of the schoolroom table and my pens, ink, and paper, had applied herself to the considerable effort of a letter to her sweetheart. There was an effort in the way that, while her arms rested on the table, her hands, with evident weariness, supported her head. But at the moment I took this in, I had already become aware that, in spite of my entrance, her attitude strangely persisted. Then it was, with the very act of announcing itself, that her identity flared up in a change of posture. She rose, not as if she had heard me, but with an indescribable, grand melancholy of indifference and detachment, and within a dozen feet of me, stood there as my vile predecessor. Dishonoured and tragic, she was all before me, but even as I fixed and, for memory, secured it, the awful image passed away. Dark as midnight in her black dress, her haggard beauty and her unutterable woe, she had looked at me long enough to appear to say that her right to sit at my table was as good as mine to sit at hers. While these instants lasted, indeed, I had the extraordinary chill of a feeling that it was I who was the intruder. It was as a wild protest against it that, actually addressing her, "You terrible, miserable woman," I heard myself break into a sound that, by the open door, rang through the long passage and the empty house. She looked at me as if she heard me, but I had recovered myself and cleared the air. There was nothing in the room the next minute but the sunshine and the sense that I must stay. I had so perfectly expected the return of the others to be marked by a demonstration that I was freshly upset at having to find them merely dumb and discreet about my desertion. Mrs. Gross made an odd face. They asked me to say nothing. They said you'd like it better. Master Mars said, "We must do nothing but what she likes." I thought a moment. "Between Miles and me, it's now all out." "All out?" My companion stared. "But what, miss?" "Everything. It doesn't matter. I've made up my mind. I came home, my dear," I went on, "for a talk with Miss Jessel." I had by this time formed the habit of having Mrs. Gross literally well in hand, in advance of my sounding that note, so that even now, as she bravely blinked under the signal of my word, I could keep her comparatively firm. A talk? Do you mean she spoke? It came to that. I found her on my return in the schoolroom. And what did she say? I can hear the good woman still, and the candour of her stupefaction. That she suffers the torments. It was this, of a truth, that made her, as she filled out my picture, gape. "Do you mean," she faltered, "of the lost?" "Of the lost, of the damned. And that's why, to share them," I faltered myself with the horror of it. But my companion, with less imagination, kept me up. "To share them? She wants Flora." Mrs. Gross might fairly have fallen away from me had I not been prepared. "As I've told you, however, it doesn't matter. Because you've made up your mind, but to what?" "Why, to sending for their uncle." "Oh, miss, in pity, do," my friend broke out. "Ah, but I will. I see it's the only way. What's out, as I told you, with Miles, is that if he thinks I'm afraid to, and has ideas of what he gains by that, he shall see he's mistaken. Yes, his uncle shall have it here from me on the spot, and before the boy if necessary, that if I'm to be reproached with having done nothing again about more school—" "Yes, miss," my companion pressed me. "Well, there's that awful reason." There were now clearly so many of these for my poor colleague that she was excusable for being vague. But, which? Why, the letter from his old place. "You'll show it to the master?" I ought to have done so on the instant. "I'll put it before him," I went on inexorably, "that I can't undertake to work the question on behalf of a child who has been expelled. For we've never in the least known what," Mrs. Gross declared. "For wickedness. For what else, when he's so clever and beautiful and perfect? Is he stupid? Is he untidy? Is he infirm? Is he ill-natured? He's exquisite. So it can be only that. And that would open up the whole thing. After all, I said, it's their uncle's fault. If he left here such people..." The next day after lessons, Mrs. Gross found a moment to say to me quietly, "Have you written, miss?" "Yes, I've written." But I didn't add, for the hour, that my letter, sealed and directed, was still in my pocket. There would be time enough to send it before the messenger should go to the village. Meanwhile, there had been on the part of my pupils no more brilliant, exemplary morning. It was exactly as if they had both had at heart to gloss over any recent little friction. They performed the dizziest feats of arithmetic, soaring quite out of my feeble range, and perpetrated in higher spirits than ever geographical and historical jokes. Miles had never been such a little gentleman as when, after our early dinner on this dreadful day, he came round to me and asked if I shouldn't like him for half an hour to play to me. David playing to Saul could never have shown a finer sense of the occasion. He sat down at the old piano and played as he had never played, and if there are those who think he had better have been kicking a football, I can only say that I wholly agree with them. For at the end of a time that, under his influence, I had quite ceased to measure, I started up with a strange sense of having literally slept at my post. It was after luncheon and by the schoolroom fire, and yet I hadn't really in the least slept. I had only done something much worse. I had forgotten. Where all this time was Flora? When I put the question to Miles, he played on a minute before answering, and then could only say, "Why, my dear, how do I know?" I went straight to my room, but his sister was not there. Then, before going downstairs, I looked into several others. As she was nowhere about, she would surely be with Mrs. Gross, whom in the comfort of that theory I accordingly proceeded in quest of. I found her where I had found her the evening before, but she met my quick challenge with blank, scared ignorance. She had only supposed that, after the repast, I had carried off both the children, as to which she was quite in her right, for it was the very first time I had allowed the little girl out of my sight without some special provision. Of course now, indeed, she might be with the maids, so that the immediate thing was to look for her without an air of alarm. This we promptly arranged between us, but when 10 minutes later, and in pursuance of our arrangement, we met in the hall, it was only to report on either side that after guarded inquiries we had altogether failed to trace her. For a minute there, apart from observation, we exchanged mute alarms, and I could feel with what high interest my friend returned me all those I had from the first given her. "She'll be above," she presently said, "in one of the rooms you haven't searched." "No, she's at a distance. I had made up my mind. She's gone out." Mrs. Gross stared. "Without a hat?" I naturally also looked volumes. "Isn't that woman always without one?" "She's with her?" "She's with her," I declared. "We must find them." My hand was on my friend's arm, but she failed for the moment, confronted with such an account of the matter, to respond to my pressure. She communed, on the contrary, where she stood with her uneasiness. "And where's Master Miles?" "Oh, he's with Quint. They'll be in the schoolroom." "Lord, miss—" My view, I was myself aware, and therefore I suppose my tone had never yet reached so calm an assurance. "The trick's played," I went on. "They've successfully worked their plan. He found the most divine little way to keep me quiet while she went off." "Divine?" Mrs. Gross echoed. "Infernal, then," I almost cheerfully rejoined. "He has provided for himself as well. But come." "You leave him?" "So long with Quint? Yes, I don't mind that now." She always ended at these moments by getting possession of my hand, and in this matter she could at present still stay me. But after gasping an instant at my sudden resignation, "Because of your letter," she eagerly brought out. I quickly, by way of answer, felt for my letter, drew it forth, held it up, and then, freeing myself, went and laid it on the great hall table. "Luke will take it," I said as I came back. I reached the house door and opened it. I was already on the steps. We went straight to the lake, which, on the few occasions of my consenting, under the protection of my pupils, to affront its surface in the old flat-bottomed boat moored there for our use, had impressed me both with its extent and its agitation. The usual place of embarkation was half a mile from the house, but I had an intimate conviction that wherever Flora might be, she was not near home. She had not given me the slip for any small adventure, and since the day of that very great one that I had shared with her by the pond, I had been aware in our walks of the quarter to which she most inclined. "You're going to the water, miss? You think she's in?" "She may be, though the depth is, I believe, nowhere very great. But what I judge most likely is that she's on the spot from which the other day we saw together what I told you." "And if she is there?" "Yes." "Then Miss Jessel is?" "Beyond a doubt. You shall see." There was no trace of Flora on that nearer side of the bank where my observation of her had been most startling, and none on the opposite edge, where, save for a margin of some 20 yards, a thick copse came down to the pond. We looked at the empty stretch, and then I felt the suggestion in my friend's eyes. No, wait. She has taken the boat. My companion stared at the vacant mooring place and then again across the lake. Then where is it? Our not seeing it is the strongest of proofs. She has used it to go over and then has managed to hide it. All alone, that child? She's not alone, and at such times she's not a child. She's an old woman. But if the boat's there, where on earth's she? That's exactly what we must learn, and I started to walk further. In the course of but few minutes more, we reached a point from which we found the boat to be where I had supposed it. It had been intentionally left as much as possible out of sight, and was tied to one of the stakes of a fence that came just there down to the brink, and that had been an assistance to disembarking. I recognized, as I looked at the pair of short, thick oars, quite safely drawn up, the prodigious character of the feat for a little girl. But I had by this time lived too long among wonders, and had pandered to too many livelier measures. There was a gate in the fence through which we passed, and that brought us, after a trifling interval, more into the open. Then, "There she is!" we both exclaimed at once. Flora, a short way off, stood before us on the grass and smiled as if her performance had now become complete. She smiled, and we met, but it was all done in a silence by this time flagrantly ominous. Mrs. Grose was the first to break the spell. She threw herself on her knees and, drawing the child to her breast, clasped in a long embrace the little, tender, yielding body. While this dumb convulsion lasted, I could only watch it, which I did the more intently when I saw Flora's face peep at me over our companion's shoulder. What she and I virtually said to each other was that pretexts were useless now. She had already got back her gaiety when she asked, "Where's Miles?" "I'll tell you if you'll tell me," I heard myself say, then heard the tremor in which it broke. "Well, what?" Mrs. Groce's suspense blazed at me, but it was too late now, and I brought the thing out handsomely. "Where, my pet, is Miss Jessel?" Just as in the churchyard with Miles, the whole thing was upon us. Much as I had made of the fact that this name had never once between us been sounded, the quick-smitten glare with which the child's face now received it fairly likened my breach of the silence to the smash of a pane of glass. It added to the interposing cry, as if to stay the blow, that Mrs. Grose at the same instant uttered over my violence the shriek of a creature scared, or rather wounded, which in turn, within a few seconds, was completed by a gasp of my own. I seized my colleague's arm. "She's there! She's there!" Miss Jessel stood before us on the opposite bank, exactly as she had stood the other time. And I remember, strangely, as the first feeling now produced in me, my thrill of joy at having brought on a proof. She was there, so I was justified. She was there, so I was neither cruel nor mad. She was there for poor scared Mrs. Grose, but she was there most for Flora. And no moment of my monstrous time was perhaps so extraordinary as that in which I consciously threw out to her, with the sense that, pale and ravenous demon as she was, she would catch and understand it, an inarticulate message of gratitude. She rose erect on the spot my friend and I had lately quitted, and there wasn't in all the long reach of her desire an inch of her evil that fell short. This first vividness of vision and emotion were things of a few seconds, during which Mrs. Groce's dazed blink across to where I pointed struck me as showing that she too at last saw, just as it carried my own eyes precipitately to the child. The revelation, then, of the manner in which Flora was affected startled me, in truth, far more than it would have done to find her also merely agitated, for direct dismay was, of course, not what I had expected. Prepared and on her guard, as our pursuit had actually made her, she would repress every betrayal, and I was therefore at once shaken by my first glimpse of the particular one for which I had not allowed. To see her, without a convulsion of her small pink face, not even feign to glance in the direction of the prodigy I announced, but only, instead of that, turn at me an expression of hard, still gravity, an expression absolutely new and unprecedented, and that appeared to read and accuse and judge me. This was a stroke that somehow converted the little girl herself into a figure portentous. I gaped at her coolness, even though my certitude of her thoroughly seeing was never greater than at that instant. And then, in the immediate need to defend myself, I called her passionately to witness. "She's there, you little unhappy thing, there, 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 and you know it as well as you know me." I had said shortly before to Mrs. Gross that she was not at these times a child, but an old, old woman, and my description of her couldn't have been more strikingly confirmed than in the way in which, for all notice of this, she simply showed me, without an expressional concession or admission, a countenance of deeper and deeper, of indeed suddenly quite fixed reprobation. I was by this time, if I can put the whole thing at all together, more appalled at what I may properly call her manner than at anything else, though it was quite simultaneously with this that I became aware of having Mrs. Gross also, and very formidably, to reckon with. My elder companion the next moment, at any rate, blotted out everything but her own flushed face and her loud, shocked protest, a burst of high disapproval. "What a dreadful turn, to be sure, miss. Where on earth do you see anything?" I could only grasp her more quickly yet, for even while she spoke, the hideous plain presence stood undimmed and undaunted. It had already lasted a minute, and it lasted while I continued, seizing my colleague, quite thrusting her at it, and presenting her to it, to insist with my pointing hand, "You don't see her exactly as we see? You mean to say you don't now? She's as big as a blazing fire. Only look, dearest woman, look!" She looked, just as I did, and gave me, with her deep groan of negation, repulsion, compassion, the mixture with her pity of her relief at her exemption, a sense, touching to me even then, that she would have backed me up if she had been able. I might well have needed that, for with this hard blow of the proof that her eyes were hopelessly sealed, I felt my own situation horribly crumble. I saw my livid predecessor press from her position on my defeat, and I took the measure, more than all, of what I should have from this instant to deal with in the astounding little attitude of Flora. Into this attitude Mrs. Gross immediately and violently entered, breaking, even while there pierced through my sense of ruin a prodigious private triumph, into breathless reassurance. "She isn't there, little lady, and nobody's there, and you never see nothing, my sweet. How can poor Miss Jessel, when poor Miss Jessel's dead and buried? We know, don't we, love?" And she appealed, blundering into the child. "It's all a mere mistake and a worry and a joke, and we'll go home as fast as we can." Our companion on this had responded with a strange, quick primness of propriety, and they were again, with Mrs. Gross on her feet, united, as it were, in shocked opposition to me. Flora continued to fix me with a small mask of disaffection, and even at that minute I prayed God to forgive me for seeming to see that, as she stood there holding tight to our friend's dress, her incomparable childish beauty had suddenly failed, had quite vanished. I've said it already. She was hideously hard. She had turned common and almost ugly. "I don't know what you mean. I see nobody. I see nothing. I never have. I think you're cruel. I don't like you." Then after this deliverance, which might have been that of a vulgarly pert little girl in the street, she hugged Mrs. Gross more closely and buried in her skirts the dreadful little face. In this position she launched an almost furious wail. "Take me away! Take me away! Oh, take me away from her!" "From me?" I panted. From you!" she cried. The wretched child had spoken exactly as if she had got from some outside source each of her stabbing little words, and I could therefore, in the full despair of all I had to accept, but sadly shake my head at her. If I had ever doubted, all my doubt would at present have gone. I've been living with this miserable truth, and now it has only too much closed round me. Of course I've lost you. I've interfered, and you've seen under her dictation, with which I faced over the pool again our infernal witness, the easy and perfect way to meet it. I've done my best, but I've lost you. Goodbye. For Mrs. Gross I had an imperative and almost frantic go, before which, in infinite distress, but mutely possessed of the little girl and clearly convinced, in spite of her blindness, that something awful had occurred and some collapse engulfed us, she retreated by the way we had come as fast as she could move. Before a new day had fully broken, my eyes opened to Mrs. Gross, who had come to my bedside with worse news. Flora was so markedly feverish that an illness was perhaps at hand. She had passed a night of extreme unrest, a night agitated above all by fears that had for their subject not in the least her former, but wholly her present governess. It was not against the possible re-entrance of Miss Jessel on the scene that she protested. It was conspicuously and passionately against mine. I was at once on my feet, and with an immense deal to ask. Flora has now her grievance, and she'll work it to the end. Yes, miss, but to what end? Why, that of dealing with me to her uncle. She'll make me out to him the lowest creature. I winced at the fair show of the scene in Mrs. Gross's face. She looked for a minute as if she sharply saw them together. And him who thinks so well of you. He has an odd way, it comes over me now, I laughed, of proving it. But that doesn't matter. What Flora wants, of course, is to get rid of me. Yet that won't do. It's you who must go. You must take Flora. My visitor at this did speculate. But where in the world? Away from here, away from them, away even most of all now from me, straight to her uncle. Only to tell on you? No, not only. To leave me, in addition, with my remedy. She was still vague. And what is your remedy? Your loyalty to begin with, and then Miles's. She looked at me hard. Do you think he won't, if he has the chance, turn on me? Yes, I venture still to think it. At all events, I want to try. Get off with his sister as soon as possible and leave me with him alone. I was amazed myself at the spirit I had still in reserve, and therefore perhaps a trifle the more disconcerted at the way in which, in spite of this fine example of it, she hesitated. There's one thing, of course, I went on. They mustn't, before she goes, see each other for 3 seconds. Are you so sure of the little gentleman? I'm not sure of anything but you, but I do believe that, poor little exquisite wretch, he wants to speak. Last evening in the firelight and the silence, he sat with me for 2 hours as if it were just coming. I can't, if her uncle sees her, consent to his seeing her brother without my having given the boy, and most of all because things have got so bad, a little more time. Unless, indeed, I wound up, you really want not to go. I could see it in her face, at last clear itself. She put out her hand to me as a pledge. I'll go, I'll go. I'll go this morning, I myself. I've heard, from that child, horrors. On my honour, miss, that the things she says. Oh, thank God. She sprang up again at this, drying her eyes with a groan. Thank God. It so justifies me. Well, it does that, miss. I saw my colleague scarce knew how to put it. Really shocking. And about me, about you, miss, since you must have it, it's beyond everything for a young lady, and I can't think wherever she must have picked up the appalling language she applies to me. I can, then. I broke in with a laugh that was doubtless significant enough. It only in truth left my friend still more grave. Well, perhaps I ought to also, since I've heard some of it before. Yet I can't bear it, the poor woman went on. I kept her, however. Ah, if you can't bear it, how can I stop with her, you mean? Why, just for that, to get her away. Far from this, she pursued. Far from them. She may be different. She may be free. I seized her with almost joy. Then, in spite of yesterday, you believe in such doings? Her simple description of them required, in the light of her expression, to be carried no further, and she gave me the whole thing as she had never done before. I believe. Yes, it was a joy, and we were still shoulder to shoulder. If I might continue sure of that, I should care but little what else happened. My support in the presence of disaster would be the same as it had been in my early need of confidence, and if my friend would answer for my honesty, I would answer for all the rest. On the point of taking leave of her, nonetheless, I was to some extent embarrassed. There's one thing, of course, that occurs to me to remember. My letter giving the alarm will have reached town before you. Your letter won't have got there. Your letter never went. What then became of it? Goodness knows. Master Miles. Do you mean he took it? I gasped. If Miles took it, he probably will have read it and destroyed it. The note I pursued will have given him so scant an advantage, for it contained only the bare demand for an interview, that he's already much ashamed of having gone so far for so little, and that what he had on his mind last evening was precisely the need of confession. I seemed to myself for the instant to have mastered it, to see it all. Leave us, leave us. I was already at the door, hurrying her off. I'll get it out of him. He'll meet me, he'll confess. If he confesses, he's saved, and if he's saved, then you are. The dear woman kissed me on this, and I took her farewell. I'll save you without him, she cried as she went. Yet it was when she had gone off, and I missed her on the spot, that the great pinch really came. I decreed that my meals with the boy should be served, as we called it, downstairs, so that I had been awaiting him in the ponderous pomp of the room outside the window of which I had had from Mrs. Gross that first scared Sunday my flash of something it would scarce have done to call light. The roast mutton was on the table, and I had dispensed with attendance. He settled to his repast with the charming little table manner that, from the day of his arrival, had relieved me of all grossness of admonition. Whatever he had been expelled from school for, it wasn't for ugly feeding. Our meal was of the briefest, mine a vain pretense, and I had the things immediately removed. While this was done, Miles stood again with his hands in his little pockets and his back to me, stood and looked out of the wide window through which that other day I had seen what pulled me up. He turned round only when the waiter had left us. Well, so we're alone. My voice trembled so that I felt it impossible to suppress the shake. Don't you remember how I told you when I came and sat on your bed the night of the storm that there was nothing in the world I wouldn't do for you? Yes, only that, I think, was to get me to do something for you. It was partly to get you to do something, I conceded, but you know, you didn't do it. Oh, yes, he said, with the brightest superficial eagerness. You wanted me to tell you something. That's it, out, straight out. What you have on your mind, you know. Ah, then is that what you stayed over for? It was as if what I had yearned for had come out at last, only to astonish me. Well, yes, I may as well make a clean breast of it. It was precisely for that. He waited so long that I supposed it for the purpose of repudiating the assumption on which my action had been founded. But what he finally said was, I'll tell you everything. I mean, I'll tell you anything you like. You'll stay on with me, and we shall both be all right, and I will tell you, I will, but not now. Why not now? He was before me again with the air of a person for whom, outside, someone who had frankly to be reckoned with was waiting. I have to see Luke. Well, then go to Luke, and I'll wait for what you promise. Only in return for that, before you leave me, one very much smaller request. He looked as if he felt he had succeeded enough to be able still a little to bargain. Tell me if, yesterday afternoon, from the table in the hall, you took, my letter. My grasp of how he received this suffered for a minute from something that I can describe only as a fierce split of my attention, a stroke that at first, as I sprang straight up, reduced me to the mere blind movement of getting hold of him, drawing him close, and, while I just fell for support against the nearest piece of furniture, instinctively keeping him with his back to the window. The appearance was full upon us that I had already had to deal with here. Peter Quint had come into view like a sentinel before a prison. The next thing I saw was that, from outside, he had reached the window, and then I knew that, close to the glass and glaring in through it, he offered once more to the room his white face of damnation. It represents but grossly what took place within me at the sight to say that on the second my decision was made. Yet I believe that no woman so overwhelmed ever in so short a time recovered her command of the act. It came to me in the very horror of the immediate presence that the act would be, seeing and facing what I saw and faced, to keep the boy himself unaware. It was like fighting with a demon for a human soul. And when I had fairly so appraised it, I saw how the human soul, held out in the tremor of my hands, at arm's length, had a perfect dew of sweat on a lovely childish forehead, The face that was close to mine was as white as the face against the glass, and out of it presently came a sound, not low nor weak, but as if from much further away, that I drank like a waft of fragrance. Yes, I took it. The glare of the face was again at the window, the scoundrel fixed as if to watch and wait. It was the very confidence that I might now defy him, as well as the positive certitude, by this time, of the child's unconsciousness that made me go on. What did you take it for? To see what you said about me? You opened the letter? I opened it. And you found nothing. I let my elation out. He gave the most mournful, thoughtful little head shake. Nothing. So, what have you done with it? I burnt it. Burnt it. It was now or never. Is that what you did at school? At school? Did you take letters or other things? Other things? Was it for that you mightn't go back? The only thing he felt was rather a dreary little surprise. Did you know I mightn't go back? I know everything. He gave me at this the longest and strangest look. Everything? Everything. Therefore, did you... But I couldn't say it again. Miles could, very simply. No, I didn't steal. What then did you do? He looked in vague pain all around the top of the room and drew his breath 2 or 3 times over, as if with difficulty. Well, I said things. Only that? They thought it was enough. To turn you out for? Well, I didn't know they'd tell. The masters, they didn't. They never told. That's why I ask you. He turned to me again, his little, beautiful, fevered face. Yes, it was too bad. Too bad. What I suppose I sometimes said to write home. I can't name the exquisite pathos of the contradiction given to such a speech by such a speaker. I only know that the next instant I heard myself throw off with homely force, stuff and nonsense. But the next after that I must have sounded stern enough. What were these things? My sternness was all for his judge, his executioner. Yet it made him avert himself again, and that movement made me, with a single bound and an irrepressible cry, spring straight upon him, for there again, against the glass, as if to blight his confession and stay his answer, was the hideous author of our woe, the white face of damnation. I felt a sick swim at the drop of my victory and all the return of my battle, so that the wildness of my veritable leap only served as a great betrayal. I saw him, from the midst of my act, meet it with a divination, and on the perception that even now he only guessed, and that the window was still to his own eyes free, I let the impulse flame up to convert the climax of his dismay into the very proof of his liberation. "No more, no more, no more!" I shrieked to my visitant, as I tried to press him against me. "Is she here?" Miles panted as he caught with his sealed eyes the direction of my words. Then, as his strange she staggered me, and with a gasp I echoed it, "Miss Jessel! Miss Jessel!" He with a sudden fury gave me back. I seized, stupefied, his supposition, some sequel to what we had done to Flora. But this made me only want to show him that it was better still than that. "It's not Miss Jessel, but it's at the window straight before us. It's there. The coward horror there for the last time." At this, after a second in which his head made the movement of a baffled dog's on a scent and then gave a frantic little shake for air and light, he was at me in a white rage, bewildered, glaring vainly over the place and missing wholly, though it now, to my sense, filled the room like the taste of poison, the wide, overwhelming presence. "It's he!" I was so determined to have all my proof that I flashed into ice to challenge him. "Whom do you mean by he?" "Peter Quint, you devil!" His face gave again round the room its convulsed supplication. Where? They are in my ears still, his supreme surrender of the name and his tribute to my devotion. What does he matter now, my own? What will he ever matter? I have you. I launched at the beast, but he has lost you forever. Then for the demonstration of my work, there, I said to Miles. But he had already jerked straight round, stared, glared again, and seen but the quiet day. With the stroke of the loss I was so proud of, he uttered the cry of a creature hurled over an abyss, and the grasp with which I recovered him might have been that of catching him in his fall. I caught him, yes. I held him. It may be imagined with what a passion, but at the end of a minute I began to feel what it truly was that I held. We were alone with the quiet day, and his little heart, dispossessed, had stopped.